The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is the head of government in the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister chairs the cabinet and selects its ministers, and advises the sovereign on the exercise of much of the royal prerogative. As modern prime ministers hold office by virtue of their ability to command the confidence of the House of Commons, they typically sit as a member of Parliament and lead the largest party or a coalition in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is by far the most powerful man in the country. He has been the principal beneficiary of the Cabinet's growth in power. The prerogatives lost by the King have fallen for the most part into the Prime Minister's hands. Those which have not been acquired by him have gone to the Cabinet. But the Prime Minister is central to its formation, central to its life, and central to its death. He forms it, he can alter it or destroy it. The government, as Graves puts it, is the master of the country and he is the master of the government. And yet the office of the Prime Minister remained unknown to the law until recently. Like the various other institutions of the country, it is the result of mere accident, the child of chance. No statute settled the status of the Prime Minister, and his salary is still drawn in part as First Lord of the Treasury, an office bound up with premiership since 1721. Not until 1878 did the term make its appearance in any public document, when Lord Beaconsfield, who signed the Treaty of Berlin, was referred to in the opening clause as First Lord of Her Majesty's Treasury, Prime Minister of England. This designation, in the opinion of Sir Sidney Low, was just a concession to the ignorance of foreigners, who might not have understood the real position of the British plenipotentiary if he had been merely given his official title. It was only in 1906 that the formal position in the order of precedence in state ceremonials was accorded to the office. The Prime Minister was made the fourth subject of the realm, just after the Archbishop of York. The Chequers Estate Act, 1917, referred to the persons holding of the office popularly known as Prime Minister and provide for the use of chequers by the incumbent of the office. The Ministers of the Crown Act, 1937, recognized for the first time the office of the Prime Minister by giving him the salary of £10,000 a year as Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. The Ministerial Salaries and Members' Pensions Act, 1965, and the Ministerial and Other Salaries Act, 1972, reiterated it. But these provisions do not confer any powers on the Prime Minister. These are casual recognition of a constitutional situation, not the legislation of that situation. The Prime Minister has no legal powers as such. His powers are derived from and are limited by constitutional conventions. Basically, it is as true today as when Gladstone said it that nowhere in the wide world does so great a substance cast so small a shadow, nowhere is there a man who has so much power, with so little to show for it in the way of formal title or prerogative. Choice of the Prime Minister. The formation of a cabinet depends essentially on the royal choice of a Prime Minister. During the 18th century, it frequently happened that there was no proper cohesion within the cabinet, and the royal favor was as necessary as the popular support for the chief minister of the crown. In the early part of the reign of George III, an attempt was made to reassert the power of the king, the object being to choose such ministers as were acceptable to himself. This attempt failed, and by 1832 the position of the Prime Minister as the leader of the predominant party in the House of Commons had become recognized. It is a well-settled rule now that the Prime Minister must be either a peer or a member of the House of Commons. Every Prime Minister since Sir Robert Walpole has been in one of the houses. No peer had been Prime Minister since the resignation of Lord Salisbury in 1902. In 1923, the question, whether a peer should be a Prime Minister, was definitely raised. The resignation of Bonar Law left the King with a choice between Lord Curzon and Stanley Baldwin. Long before this it had been felt that the Prime Minister must belong to the House which made and unmade a government. It had also been asserted that the House of Commons had a right to expect that its chief representative should be within its influence personally accountable to it. Lord Curzon, no doubt, was a peer, but it was not the only issue. The scales were heavily weighted against him because of his personality. Both these factors put together resulted in the selection of Stanley Baldwin, whose cabinet experience was limited to 8 months of Bonner law government, as Prime Minister. It is claimed that the decision of the King was finally determined by the advice given by Earl Balfour, although George V had also consulted other prominent Conservatives including Lord Long, Lord Salisbury and L.S. Amory. Lord Stamfordham, on behalf of the King, explained to Lord Curzon that since the Labour Party constituted the official opposition in the House of Commons and were unrepresented in the House of Lords, the objections to a Prime Minister in the upper chamber were insuperable. A single precedent, however, does not create a rule that a Prime Minister must necessarily be from the House of Commons, but the election of a peer, as Keith rightly remarks, for that office would be abnormal, if the government owns responsibility to the House of Commons alone. A vote in that House only can compel the government either to resign or to advise a dissolution. Moreover, the Prime Minister is also responsible for the party organization. Party organization matters only in the House of Commons and not in the House of Lords. If, in brief, the Prime Minister is to correctly feel the pulse of Parliament and in the ultimate analysis that of the electorate, he can do so in the House of Commons. The precedent that the Prime Minister should belong to the House of Commons must, therefore, be regarded as decisive. Baldwin did not show the slightest desire to continue his premiership on his transfer to the House of Lords. Professor Keith is of the opinion that had Baldwin decided to continue, such a decision would certainly have been popular enough in the country after he had established his reputation by his brilliant handling of the abdication of Edward VIII. He holds that it remains possible that a Prime Minister might retain that office after transfer to the upper house. But it is doubtful if any Prime Minister will ever venture it now. Earl Home disclaimed his peerage, under the Peerage Act, 1963, and became Sir Alec Douglas Home and succeeded Harold Macmillan as the Prime Minister. The new methods of choosing a Prime Minister adopted by both Labour and Conservative parties preclude the possibility of a peer being elevated to this august office now. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is the head of government of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister advises the sovereign on the exercise of much of the royal prerogative, chairs the cabinet and selects its ministers. As modern Prime Ministers hold office by virtue of their ability to command the confidence of the House of Commons, they sit as members of Parliament. The office of Prime Minister is not established by any statute or constitutional document, but exists only by long-established convention, whereby the monarch appoints as Prime Minister the person most likely to command the confidence of the House of Commons. In practice, this is the leader of the political party that holds the largest number of seats in the Commons. The Prime Minister is ex officio also First Lord of the Treasury, prior to 1905 also the official title of the position, Minister for the Civil Service, the Minister responsible for national security, and Minister for the Union. The Prime Minister's official residence and office is 10 Downing Street in London. 57 people, 54 men and 3 women, have served as Prime Minister, the first of whom was Robert Walpole taking office on April 3, 1721. The longest-serving Prime Minister was also Walpole, who served over 20 years, and the shortest-serving was Liz Truss, who served 7 weeks. The presumptive Prime Minister is Keir Starmer of the Labour Party, who will assume the office on July 5, 2024, succeeding the incumbent Rishi Sunak of the Conservative Party, following the latter's party loss at the 2024 general election. The position of Prime Minister was not created, it evolved slowly and organically over 300 years due to numerous acts of Parliament, political developments, and accidents of history. The office is therefore best understood from a historical perspective. The origins of the position are found in constitutional changes that occurred during the Revolutionary Settlement, 1688 to 1720, and the resulting shift of political power from the sovereign to Parliament. Although the sovereign was not stripped of their ancient prerogative powers and legally remained the head of government, politically it gradually became necessary for him or her to govern through a Prime Minister who could command a majority in Parliament. By the 1830s, the Westminster system of government, or cabinet government, had emerged, the Prime Minister had become primus inter pares, or the first among equals in the cabinet and the head of government in the United Kingdom, while it became increasingly seen as an affront to the constitution for the monarch to interfere directly with the business of government. The political position of Prime Minister was enhanced by the development of modern political parties, the introduction of mass communication and photography. By the start of the 20th century, the modern premiership had emerged. The office had become the preeminent position in the constitutional hierarchy in relation to the sovereign, parliament and cabinet. Before 1902, the Prime Minister sometimes sat in the House of Lords, provided that his government could form a majority in the Commons. However, as the power of the aristocracy waned during the 19th century, the convention developed that the Prime Minister should always sit as a member of Parliament in the lower house, making them answerable only to the Commons in Parliament. The Prime Minister's authority was further enhanced by the Parliament Act 1911, which marginalized the influence of the House of Lords in the lawmaking process. The Prime Minister is the head of the United Kingdom government. As such, the modern Prime Minister leads the cabinet, the executive. In addition, the Prime Minister leads a major political party and generally commands a majority in the House of Commons, the lower chamber of Parliament. The incumbent wields both significant legislative and executive powers. Under the British system, there is a unity of powers rather than separation. In the House of Commons, the Prime Minister guides the lawmaking process with the goal of enacting the legislative agenda of their political party. In an executive capacity, the Prime Minister appoints, and may dismiss, all other cabinet members and ministers, and coordinates the policies and activities of all government departments, and the staff of the civil service. The Prime Minister also acts as the public face and voice of His Majesty's government, both at home and abroad. Solely upon the advice of the Prime Minister, the sovereign exercises many statutory and prerogative powers, including high judicial, political, official and Church of England ecclesiastical appointments, the conferral of peerages and some knighthoods, decorations and other important honours. The British system of government is based on an uncodified constitution, meaning that it is not set out in any single document. The British Constitution consists of many documents, and most importantly for the evolution of the office of the Prime Minister, it is based on customs known as constitutional conventions that became accepted practice. In 1928, Prime Minister H. H. Asquith described this characteristic of the British Constitution in his memoirs. In this country we live, under an unwritten constitution. It is true that we have on the statute book great instruments like Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the Bill of Rights, which define and secure many of our rights and privileges, but the great bulk of our constitutional liberties and our constitutional practices do not derive their validity and sanction from any bill which has received the formal assent of the King, Lords and Commons. They rest on usage, custom, convention, often of slow growth in their early stages, not always uniform, but which in the course of time received universal observance and respect. The relationships between the Prime Minister and the sovereign, Parliament and Cabinet are defined largely by these unwritten conventions of the Constitution. Many of the Prime Minister's executive and legislative powers are actually royal prerogatives which are still formally vested in the sovereign, who remains the head of state. Despite its growing dominance in the constitutional hierarchy, the premiership was given little formal recognition until the 20th century. The legal fiction was maintained that the sovereign still governed directly. The position was first mentioned in statute only in 1917, in the schedule of the Chequers Estate Act. Increasingly during the 20th century, the office and role of Prime Minister featured in statute law and official documents. However, the Prime Minister's powers and relationships with other institutions still largely continue to derive from ancient royal prerogatives and historic and modern constitutional conventions. Prime Ministers continue to hold the position of First Lord of the Treasury and, since November 1968, that of Minister for the Civil Service, the latter giving them authority over the civil service. Under this arrangement, Britain might appear to have two executives, the Prime Minister and the Sovereign. The concept of the Crown resolves this paradox. The crown symbolizes the state's authority to govern, to make laws and execute them, impose taxes and collect them, declare war and make peace. Before the glorious revolution of 1688, the sovereign exclusively wielded the powers of the crown. Afterwards, Parliament gradually forced monarchs to assume a neutral political position. Parliament has effectively dispersed the powers of the crown, entrusting its authority to responsible ministers, the Prime Minister and Cabinet, accountable for their policies and actions to Parliament, in particular the elected House of Commons. Although many of the sovereign's prerogative powers are still legally intact, constitutional conventions have removed the monarch from day-to-day governance, with ministers exercising the royal prerogatives, leaving the monarch in practice with three constitutional rights: to be kept informed, to advise, and to warn. In modern times, much of the process involving prime ministerial appointments is informally governed by constitutional conventions and authoritative sources, like the Cabinet Manual, paragraphs 2.7 to 2.20 and 3.1 to 3.2. The Prime Minister is appointed by the monarch, through the exercise of the royal prerogative. In the past, the monarch has used personal choice to dismiss or appoint a Prime Minister, the last time being in 1834, but it is now the convention that the monarch should not be drawn into party politics. The Prime Minister holds that position by virtue of his or her ability to command the confidence of the House of Commons, which in turn commands the confidence of the electorate, as expressed through a general election. By convention, the Prime Minister is also an MP and is normally the leader of the political party that commands a majority in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister's office helps the Prime Minister to establish and deliver the government's overall strategy and policy priorities, and to communicate the government's policies to Parliament, the public and international audiences. The Prime Minister's office is formally part of the Cabinet Office, but the boundary between its work and that of the wider Cabinet Office can be unclear. The wider Cabinet Office might carry out very similar work. Peter Hennessy has claimed that this overall arrangement means there is in fact effectively a Prime Minister's department, though it is not called this. Prime Minister's Questions is a constitutional convention, currently held as a single session every Wednesday at noon when the House of Commons is sitting, in which the Prime Minister answers questions from members of Parliament, MPs. The Leader of the Opposition usually asks the Prime Minister 6 questions, and the Leader of the third largest parliamentary party can ask 2 questions. It is an occasion when the Prime Minister appears regularly on live television and radio. The Prime Minister also appears before the Liaison Committee to answer questions about public policy. The personal protection of the Prime Minister and former Prime Ministers is the responsibility of Protection Command within the Metropolitan Police Service. The fleet of Prime Ministerial cars provides the Prime Minister with a number of security features as well as transport. The vehicles are driven by officers from this unit. Air transport for the Prime Minister is provided by a variety of military and civilian operators. One of the roles of the Prime Minister is to represent the UK at home and abroad, for example at the annual G7 summit. The Prime Minister makes many international trips. According to Gus O'Donnell, the number of overseas visits for the Prime Minister has gone up. Prime Ministers have had various deputies, sometimes as an official Deputy Prime Minister, First Secretary of State or de facto deputy. Some Prime Ministers have not chosen a deputy at all, preferring ad hoc arrangements. Nobody has the right of automatic succession to the Prime Ministership. It is generally considered that in the event of the death of the Prime Minister, it would be appropriate to appoint an interim Prime Minister, though there is some debate as to how to decide who this should be. According to Rodney Brazier, there are no procedures within government to cope with the sudden death of the Prime Minister. There is also no such title as Acting Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Despite refusing to discuss a hypothetical situation with BBC News in 2011, the Cabinet Office said the following in 2006. There is no single protocol setting out all of the possible implications. However, the general constitutional position is as set out below. There can be no automatic assumption about who the Queen would ask to act as caretaker Prime Minister in the event of the death of the Prime Minister. The decision is for her under the royal prerogative. However, there are some key guiding principles. The Queen would probably be looking for a very senior member of the government, not necessarily a Commons minister, since this would be a short-term appointment. If there was a recognized deputy to the Prime Minister, used to acting on his behalf in his absences, this could be an important factor. Also important would be the question of who was likely to be in contention to take over long-term as Prime Minister. If the most senior member of the government was him or herself a contender for the role of Prime Minister, it might be that the Queen would invite a slightly less senior non-contender. In these circumstances, her private secretary would probably take soundings, via the Cabinet Secretary, of members of the Cabinet, to ensure that the Queen invited someone who would be acceptable to the Cabinet to act as their chair during the caretaker period. Once the party had elected a new leader, that person would, of course, be invited to take over as Prime Minister. Additionally, when the Prime Minister is traveling, it is standard practice for a senior duty minister to be appointed who can attend to urgent business and meetings if required, though the Prime Minister remains in charge and updated throughout. On April 6, 2020, when Prime Minister Boris Johnson was admitted into ICU, he asked First Secretary of State Dominic Raab to deputise for him where necessary. A Prime Minister ends their tenure by offering their resignation to the British monarch. This can happen after their party has suffered a general election defeat, so that they no longer command the confidence of the House of Commons. It can also happen mid-term, if they are forced to resign for political reasons, or for other reasons such as ill health. If the Prime Minister resigns mid-term, and their party has a majority in the Commons, the party selects a new leader according to its rules, and this new leader is invited by the monarch to become the new Prime Minister. The outgoing Prime Minister is likely to remain in post until the new leader has been chosen by the party. After resigning, the outgoing Prime Minister remains a member of Parliament. An outgoing Prime Minister can ask the monarch to bestow honours on any number of people of their choosing, known as the Prime Minister's resignation honours. No incumbent Prime Minister has ever lost their own seat at a general election. Only one Prime Minister has been assassinated, Spencer Perceval, in 1812. On taking office, a new Prime Minister usually makes a public statement to announce to the country that they have been appointed by the reigning monarch, called kissing hands. This is usually done by saying words to the effect of, "His Majesty the King, Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a government and I have accepted." Throughout the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister outranks all other dignitaries except members of the royal family, the Lord Chancellor, and senior ecclesiastical figures. In 2010, the Prime Minister received £142,500 including a salary of £65,737 as a Member of Parliament. Until 2006, the Lord Chancellor was the highest paid member of the government, ahead of the Prime Minister. This reflected the Lord Chancellor's position at the head of the judicial pay scale. The Constitutional Reform Act 2005 eliminated the Lord Chancellor's judicial functions and also reduced the office's salary to below that of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is customarily a member of the Privy Council and thus entitled to the appellation the Right Honourable. Membership of the Council is retained for life. It is a constitutional convention that only a Privy Councillor can be appointed Prime Minister. Most potential candidates have already attained this status. The only case when a non-Privy Councillor was the natural appointment was Ramsay MacDonald in 1924. The issue was resolved by appointing him to the Council immediately prior to his appointment as Prime Minister. According to the now-defunct Department for Constitutional Affairs, the Prime Minister is made a Privy Councillor as a result of taking office and should be addressed by the official title prefixed by the Right Honourable and not by a personal name. Although this form of address is employed on formal occasions, it is rarely used by the media. As Prime Minister is a position, not a title, the incumbent should be referred to as the Prime Minister, although the title Prime Minister, e.g. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, has become commonplace within current political reporting. Within the UK, the expression Prime Minister Starmer is never used, although it, too, is sometimes used by foreign dignitaries and news sources. 10. Downing Street in London has been the official place of residence of the Prime Minister since 1732. They are entitled to use its staff and facilities, including extensive offices. Chequers, a country house in Buckinghamshire, gifted to the government in 1917, may be used as a country retreat for the Prime Minister. Upon retirement, it is customary for the sovereign to grant a Prime Minister some honour or dignity. The honour bestowed is commonly, but not invariably, membership of the UK's most senior order of chivalry, the Order of the Garter. The practice of creating a retired Prime Minister a Knight Companion of the Garter, KG, has been fairly prevalent since the mid-19th century. Upon the retirement of a Prime Minister who is Scottish, it is likely that the primarily Scottish honour of Knight of the Thistle, KT, will be used instead of the Order of the Garter, which is generally regarded as an English honour. Historically, it has also been common to grant Prime Ministers a peerage upon retirement from the Commons, elevating the individual to the Lords. Formerly, the peerage bestowed was usually an earldom. The last such creation was for Harold Macmillan, who resigned in 1963. Unusually, he became Earl of Stockton only in 1984, over 20 years after leaving office. Macmillan's successors Alec Douglas Home, Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, Margaret Thatcher and David Cameron all accepted life peerages, although Douglas Home had previously disclaimed his hereditary title as Earl of Home. Edward Heath did not accept a peerage of any kind, neither have any of the Prime Ministers who have retired since 1990 other than Cameron, having done so to rejoin the cabinet, rather than as an honour per se. Edward Heath, in 1992, John Major, in 2005, and Tony Blair, in 2022, were appointed as Knights Companion of the Garter. Major, in 1998, and Gordon Brown, in 2024, were appointed members of the Order of the Companions of Honour, although Blair had previously disclosed that he did not want honours bestowed for himself or future Prime Ministers. The most recent former Prime Minister to die was Margaret Thatcher, 1979 to 1990, on April 8, 2013. Her death meant that for the first time since 1955, the year in which the Earldom of Attlee was created, subsequent to the death of Earl Baldwin in 1947, the membership of the House of Lords included no former Prime Minister, a situation which remained the case until David Cameron was appointed to the House in November 2023. All former Prime Ministers are entitled to claim for salary or office expenses incurred in fulfilling public duties in that role. The allowance may not be used to pay for private or parliamentary duties. It is administered by the Cabinet Office Finance Team. The maximum amount which may be claimed per year is £115,000, plus 10% towards any staff pension costs. This limit is reviewed annually, and at the start of each Parliament, by the Prime Minister. The maximum level may be adjusted downwards if the former Prime Minister receives any public funds for fulfilling other public appointments. Downing Street confirmed in November 2023 that former Prime Minister David Cameron would not claim from the PDCA while he is Foreign Secretary. Thank you for watching this video.